Hello, Jacqueline. Hello, Tyrell. When are we going to get into a new novel? I think we are going to get into a new novel. There's a couple that I'm trying to get. But we will start a new novel probably on Sunday. I haven't decided for sure what I'm going to read next. So probably Sunday. We'll do today. I might be taking tomorrow off, depending on the weather. If the weather is nice, I'll probably be taking it off so that I can have a fire in my backyard. And it's a little too early before and it's a little too late after. So my bike ride was fabulous. Thanks for asking, Tyrell. Nice down the river valley and around town. So we'll probably get into a new novel on Sunday. I have some thoughts about which novel, but I haven't decided for sure yet. So we'll do a little bit more James Herriot today, and then we will see. Probably we're taking tomorrow and Saturday off, and then back into a new novel on Sunday. As usual, I do welcome suggestions. I have to go through my messages and look for previous suggestions and make sure that I jot them all down so that I don't miss anything. Alright, let us get started today. Some James Herriot. Pull this down a little bit. There we go. A lesson from a coalman's horse. I could look back now on 6 months of hard practical experience. I had treated cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and cats 7 days a week, in the morning, afternoon, evening, and through the hours when the world was asleep. I had calved cows and farrowed sows till my arms ached and the skin peeled off. I'd been knocked down, trampled on, and sprayed liberally with every kind of muck. I had seen a fair cross-section of the diseases of animals, and yet a little voice had begun to niggle at the back of my mind. It said I knew nothing, nothing at all. Ooh, you may suggest Robert Munch. Definitely. This was strange, because those 6 months had been built upon 5 years of theory, a slow, painful assimilation of thousands of facts, and a careful storage of fragments of knowledge, like a squirrel with its nuts, beginning with the study of plants and the lowest forms of life, working up to dissection in the anatomy lab and physiology and the vast, soulless territory of materia medica, then pathology, which tore down the curtain of ignorance and let me look for the first time into the deep secrets, and parasitology, the teeming other world of the worms and fleas and mange mites. Finally, medicine and surgery, the crystallization of my learning and its application to the everyday troubles of animals. And there were many others, like physics, chemistry, hygiene. They didn't seem to have missed a thing. Why, then, should I feel I knew nothing? Why had I begun to feel like an astronomer looking through a telescope at an unknown galaxy? The sensation that I was only groping about on the fringes of limitless space was depressing. Pardon me. It was a funny thing, because everybody else seemed to know all about sick animals. The chap who held the cow's tail, the neighbour from the next farm, men in pubs, jobbing gardeners, they all knew and were free and confident with their advice. I tried to think back over my life. Was there any time when I had felt this supreme faith in my own knowledge? And then I remembered. I was back in Scotland. I was 17, and I was walking under the arch of the veterinary college into Montrose Street. I had been a student for 3 days, but not until this afternoon had I felt the thrill of fulfillment. Messing about with botany and zoology was all right, but this afternoon had been the real thing. I had had my first lecture in animal husbandry. The subject had been the points of the horse. Professor Grant had hung up a life-size picture of a horse and gone over it from nose to tail, indicating the withers, the stifle, the hock, the pole, and all the other rich equine terms. And the professor had been wise. To make his lecture more interesting, he kept throwing in little practical points like, "This is where we find curb," or "Here is the site for wind galls." He talked of thoropins and side bones, splints and quitor, things the students wouldn't learn about for another 4 years, but it brought it all to life. The words were still spinning in my head as I walked slowly down the sloping street. This was what I had come for. I felt as though I had undergone an initiation and become a member of an exclusive club. I really knew about horses, and I was wearing a brand new riding mac with all sorts of extra straps and buckles which slapped against my legs as I turned the corner of the hill into busy Newton Road. I could hardly believe my luck when I saw the horse. It was standing outside the library below Queen's Cross, like something left over from another age. It drooped dispiritedly between the shafts of a coal cart, which stood like an island in an eddying stream of cars and buses. Pedestrians hurried by, uncaring, but I had the feeling that fortune was smiling on me. A horse, not a picture, but a real, genuine horse. Stray words from the lecture floated up into my mind. The pastern, cannonbone, coronet, and all those markings. Snip, blaze, white sock near hind. I stood on the pavement and examined the animal critically. I thought it must be obvious to every passer-by that here was a true expert, not just an inquisitive onlooker, but a man who knew and understood all. I felt clothed in a visible aura of horsiness. I took a few steps up and down, hands deep in the pockets of the new riding mac, eyes probing for possible shoeing faults, or curbs, or bog spavins. So thorough was my inspection that I worked round to the off-side of the horse and stood perilously among the racing traffic. I glanced around at the people hurrying past. Nobody seemed to care, not even the horse. He was a large one, at least 17 hands, and he gazed apathetically down the street, easing his hind legs alternatively in a bored manner. I hated to leave him, but I had completed my examination, and it was time I was on my way. But I felt that I ought to make a gesture before I left, something to communicate to the horse that I understood his problems, and that we belonged to the same brotherhood. I stepped briskly forward and patted him on the neck. Quick as a striking snake, the horse whipped downwards and seized my shoulder in great strong teeth. He laid back his ears, rolled his eyes wickedly, and hoisted me up almost off my feet. I hung there helplessly, suspended like a lopsided puppet. I wriggled and kicked, but the teeth were clamped immovably in the material of my coat. There was no doubt about the interest of the passers-by now. The grotesque sight of a man hanging from a horse's mouth brought them to a sudden halt, and a crowd formed, with people looking over each other's shoulders, and others fighting at the back to see what was going on. A horrified old lady was crying, "Oh, poor boy! Help him, somebody!" Some of the braver characters tried pulling at me, but the horse whickered ominously and hung on tighter. Conflicting advice was shouted from all sides. With deep shame, I saw 2 attractive girls in the front row, giggling helplessly. Appalled at the absurdity of my position, I began to thrash about wildly. My shirt collar tightened round my throat. A stream of the horse's saliva trickled down the front of my mac. I could feel myself choking, and was giving up hope when a man pushed his way through the crowd. He was very small. Angry eyes glared from a face blackened by coal dust. 2 empty sacks were draped over an arm. "What the hell's this?" he shouted. A dozen replies babbled in the air. "Can you no leave the bloody horse alone?" he yelled into my face. I made no reply, being pop-eyed, half-throttled, and in no mood for conversation. The coalman turned his fury on the horse. "Drop him, you big bastard! Go on, let go! Drop him!" Getting no response, he dug the animal viciously in the belly with his thumb. The horse took the point at once, and released me like an obedient dog dropping a bone. I fell on my knees and ruminated in the gutter for a while, till I could breathe more easily. As from a great distance I could still hear the little man shouting at me. After some time I stood up. The coalman was still shouting, and the crowd was listening appreciatively. "What do you think you're playing at? Keep your hands off my bloody horse! Get the police to you!" I looked down at my new mac. The shoulder was chewed to a sodden mass. I felt I must escape, and began to edge my way through the crowd. Some of the faces were concerned, but most were grinning. Once clear, I started to walk away rapidly, and as I turned the corner, the last faint cry from the coalman reached me. "Dinna meddle with things you ken nothing about." Hello, Katya. The perils of being puffed up too much with knowledge. Chapter 13. The Perils of Tricky Woo. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. "He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so I've been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some calf's foot jelly, and malt and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much, really." "And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you?" "Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates so I can't bear to refuse him." "Chocolates? Eh?" I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. The pâté on thin biscuits, the fudge, the rich trifles. Tricky loved them all. "Are you giving him plenty of exercise?" "Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin has been down with lumbago, so there's been no ring throwing lately." I tried to sound severe. "Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet." Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. "Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. I'm sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult." She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. I watched her progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats, warm tweed or tartan ones for the cold weather, and mackintoshes for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favourite dishes, and besides he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go on walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight, to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She had never been separated from her darling before. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched up to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. "Poor old lad," I said. "You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you." At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object, and ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box, next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe the Greyhound and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat, but obviously intrigued. Later that day I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way toward it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtimes, and hunting rats in the old henhouse at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly, or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period there were 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of sherry began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was the same delicious vintage that I knew so well, and it was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion, with 2 glasses before and several during the meal. Siegfried and Tristan took turns at proposing Tricky's health, and the standard of speech-making improved daily. As the sponsor, I was always called upon to reply. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came. 2 bottles of cordon bleu, intended to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. Siegfried dug out some balloon glasses belonging to his mother. I had never seen them before, but for a few nights they saw constant service as the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, bolstered up and sustained by the midday sherry, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open when Tricky saw his mistress. And when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled, "Oh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." Quite the triumph of surgery. The right medicine will do it every time. Fooled by a cow. I could see that Mr. Hanshaw didn't believe a word I was saying. He looked down at this cow and his mouth tightened into a stubborn line. "Broken pelvis? You're trying to tell me she'll never get up no more? Why, look at her chewing her cud. I'll tell you this, young man, me dad would have soon got her up if he'd been alive today." I had been a veterinary surgeon for a year now, and I had learned a few things. One of them was that farmers weren't easy men to convince, especially Yorkshire dalesmen. And that bit about his dad. Mr. Hanshaw was in his 50s, and I suppose there was something touching about his faith in his late father's skill and judgment, but I could have done very nicely without it. It had acted as an additional irritant in a case in which I felt I had troubles enough. because there are few things which get more deeply under a vet's skin than a cow which won't get up. To the layman it may seem strange that an animal can be apparently cured of its original ailment, and yet be unable to rise from the floor, but it happens, and it can be appreciated that a completely recumbent milk cow has no future. The case had started when my boss, Siegfried Farnan, who owned the practice in the little Dales market town of Derby, sent me to a milk fever. This suddenly occurring calcium deficiency attacks high-yielding animals just after calving and causes collapse and progressive coma. When I first saw Mr. Hanshaw's cow, she was stretched out motionless on her side, and I had to look carefully to make sure she wasn't dead. But I got out my bottles of calcium with an airy confidence, because I had been lucky enough to qualify just about the time when the profession had finally got on top of this hitherto fatal condition. The breakthrough had come many years earlier with the inflation of the udder, and I still carried a little blowing-up outfit around with me. The farmers used bicycle pumps. But with the advent of calcium therapy, one could bask in a cheap glory by jerking an animal back from imminent death within minutes. The skill required was minimal, but it looked very, very good. By the time I had injected the 2 bottles, one into the vein, the other under the skin, and Mr. Hanshaw had helped me roll the cow onto her chest, the improvement was already obvious. She was looking about her and shaking her head as if wondering where she had been for the last few hours. I felt sure that if I had had the time to hang about for a bit, I could see her on her feet, but other jobs were waiting. "Give me a ring if she isn't up by dinner time," I said, but it was a formality. I was pretty sure I wouldn't be seeing her again. When the farmer rang at midday to say she was still down, it was just a pinprick. Some cases needed an extra bottle. It would be all right. I went out and injected her again. I wasn't really worried when I learned she hadn't got up the following day, but Mr. Hanshaw, hands deep in pockets, shoulders hunched as he stood over his cow, was grievously disappointed at my lack of success. "It's time t'old bitch was up. She's doing no good laid there. Surely there's summat you can do. I poured a bottle of water into her lug this morning, but even that hasn't shifted her." "You what?" "Poured some cold water down her lug hole. Me dad used to get him up that way, and he was a very clever man with stock, was me dad." "I've no doubt he was," I said primly, "but I really think another injection is more likely to help her." The farmer watched glumly as I ran yet another bottle of calcium under the skin. The procedure had lost its magic for him. As I put the apparatus away, I did my best to be hearty. "I shouldn't worry. A lot of them stay down for a day or two. You'll probably find her walking about in the morning." The phone rang just before breakfast, and my stomach contracted sharply as I heard Mr. Hanshaw's voice. It was heavy with gloom. "Well, she's no different. Lying there eating her head off, but never offers to rise. What are you going to do now?" What indeed, I thought as I drove out to the farm. The cow has been down for 48 hours. I didn't like it a bit. The farmer went into the attack immediately. "Me dad always used to say they had a worm in the tail when they stayed down like this. He said if you cut tail end off, it did the trick." My spirits sagged lower. I had had trouble with this myth before. The insidious thing was that the people who still practiced this relic of barbarism could often claim that it worked because, after the end of the tail had been chopped off, the pain of the stump touching the ground forced many a sulky cow to scramble to her feet. "There's no such thing as a worm in the tail, Mr. Hanshaw," I said. "And don't you think it's a cruel business, cutting off a cow's tail? I hear the RSPCA had a man in court last week over a job like that." The farmer narrowed his eyes. Clearly he thought I was hedging. "Well, if you won't do that, what the hangment are you going to do? We've got to get this cow up somehow." I took a deep breath. "Well, I'm sure she's got over the milk fever because she's eating well and looks quite happy. It must be a touch of posterior paralysis that's keeping her down. There's no point in giving her any more calcium, so I'm going to try this stimulant injection." I filled the syringe with a feeling of doom. I hadn't a scrap of faith in the stimulant injection, but I just couldn't do nothing. I was scraping the barrel out now. I was turning to go when Mr. Hanshaw called after me. "Hey, mister, I remember summat else me dad used to do. Shout in their lugs. He got many a cow up that way. I'm not very strong in the voice. How about you having a go?" It was a bit late to stand on my dignity. I went over to the animal and seized her by the ear. Inflating my lungs to the utmost, I bent down and bawled wildly into the hairy depths. The cow stopped chewing for a moment and looked at me inquiringly, and then her eyes drooped and she returned contentedly to her cutting. "We'll give her another day," I said wearily, "and if she's still down tomorrow we'll have a go at lifting her. Could you get a few of your neighbours to give us a hand?" Driving round my other cases that day, I felt tied up inside with sheer frustration. Damn and blast the thing! What the hell was keeping her down? And what else could I do? This was 1938 and my resources were limited. 30 years later there are still milk fever cows which won't get up, but the vet has a much wider armory if the calcium has failed to do the job. The excellent Bagshaw hoist, which clamps onto the pelvis and raises the animal in a natural manner. The phosphorus injections, even the electric goad, which administers a swift shock when applied to the rump, and sends many a comfortably ensconced cow leaping to her feet with an offended bellow. As I expected, the following day brought no change, and as I got out of the car in Mr. Hanshaw's yard, I was surrounded by a group of his neighbours. They were in a festive mood, grinning, confident, full of helpful advice, as farmers always are with somebody else's animals. There was much laughter and leg-pulling as we drew sacks under the cow's body, and a flood of weird suggestions, to which I tried to close my ears. When we all finally gave a concerted heave and lifted her up, the result was predictable. She just hung there placidly with her legs dangling, while her owner leaned against the wall, watching us with deepening gloom. After a lot of puffing and grunting, we lowered the inert body, and everybody looked at me for the next move. I was hunting round desperately in my mind when Mr. Hanshaw piped up again. "Me dad always used to say a strange dog would always get a cow up." There were murmurs of assent from the assembled farmers, and immediate offers of dogs. I tried to point out that one would be enough, but my authority had dwindled, and anyway, everybody seemed anxious to demonstrate their dog's cow-raising potential. There was a sudden, excited exodus, and even Mr. Smedley, the village shopkeeper, pedalled off at frantic speed for his border terrier. It seemed only minutes before the buyer was alive with snapping, snarling curs, but the cow ignored them all, except to wave her horns warningly at the ones which came too close. The flashpoint came when Mr. Hanshaw's own dog came in from the fields where he had been helping to round up the sheep. He was a skinny, hard-bitten little creature, with lightning reflexes and a short temper. He stalked, stiff-legged and bristling, into the byre, took a single astounded look at the pack of foreigners on his territory, and flew into action with silent venom. Within seconds, the finest dog-fight I had ever seen was in full swing, and I stood back and surveyed the scene with a feeling of being completely superfluous. The yells of the farmers rose above the enraged yapping and growling. One intrepid man leapt into the melee and reappeared with a tiny Jack Russell hanging on determinedly to the heel of his Wellington boot. Mr. Reynolds of Clover Hill was rubbing the cow's tail between two short sticks and shouting, "Cush! Cush!" And as I watched helplessly, a total stranger tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Has to trade a teaspoonful of Jay's fluid in a pint of old beer every 2 hours?" It seemed to me that all the forces of black magic had broken through and were engulfing me, and that my slender resources of science had no chance of shoring up the dike. I don't know how I heard the creaking sound above the din. Probably because I was bending low over Mr. Reynolds in an attempt to persuade him to desist from his tail rubbing. But at that moment the cow shifted her position slightly, and I distinctly heard it. It came from the pelvis. It took me some time to attract attention. I think everybody had forgotten I was there, but finally the dogs were separated and secured with innumerable lengths of binder twine. Everybody stopped shouting. Mr. Reynolds was pulled away from the tail, and I had the stage. I addressed myself to Mr. Hanshaw. "Would you get me a bucket of hot water, some soap, and a towel, please?" He trailed off, grumbling, as though he didn't expect much from the new gambit. My stock was definitely low. I stripped off my jacket, soaped my arms, and pushed a hand into the cow's rectum until I felt the hard bone of the pubis. Gripping it through the wall of the rectum, I looked up at my audience. "Will two of you get hold of the hook bones and rock the cow gently from side to side?" Yes, there it was again, no mistake about it. I could both hear and feel it, a looseness, a faint creaking, almost a grating. I got up and washed my arm. Well, I know why your cow won't get up. She has a broken pelvis. Probably did it during the first night when she was staggering about with the milk fever. I should think the nerves are damaged too. It's hopeless, I'm afraid. Even though I was dispensing bad news, it was a relief to come up with something rational. Mr. Hanshaw stared at me. Hopeless? How's that? I'm sorry, I said, but that's how it is. The only thing you can do is get her off to the butcher. She has no power in her hind legs. She'll never get up again. That was when Mr. Hanshaw really blew his top and started a lengthy speech. He wasn't really unpleasant or abusive, but firmly pointed out my shortcomings and bemoaned again the tragic fact that his dad was not there to put everything right. The other farmers stood in a wide-eyed ring, enjoying every word. At the end of it, I took myself off. There was nothing more I could do, and anyway, Mr. Hanshaw would have to come round to my way of thinking. Time would prove me right. I thought of that cow as soon as I woke next morning. It hadn't been a happy episode, but at least I did feel a certain peace in the knowledge that there were no more doubts. I knew it was wrong. I knew that there was no hope. There was nothing more to worry about. I was surprised when I heard Mr. Hanshaw's voice on the phone so soon. I'd thought it would take him 2 or 3 days to realize he was wrong. Is that Mr. Herriot? Aye, well, good morning to you. I'm just ringing to tell you that me cow's up on her legs and doing fine. I gripped the receiver tightly with both hands. What? What's that you say? I said me cow's up. Found her walking about the byre this morning, fit as a fiddle. You'd think there'd never been aught the matter with her. He paused for a few moments and then spoke with grave deliberation like a disapproving schoolmaster. And you stood there and looked at me and said she'd never get up no more. But... Ah, you're wondering how I did it? Well, I just happened to remember another old trick of me dad's. I went round to butcher and got a fresh-killed sheepskin and put it on her back. Had her up in no time. You'll have to come round and see her. Wonderful man was me dad. Blindly, I made my way into the dining room. I had to consult my boss about this. Siegfried's sleep had been broken by a 3 a.m. calving, and he looked a lot older than his 30-odd years. He listened in silence as he finished his breakfast, then pushed away his plate and poured a last cup of coffee. Hard luck, James. The old sheepskin, eh? Funny thing, you've been in the Dales over a year now and never come across that one. Suppose it must be going out of fashion a bit now, but you know it has a grain of sense behind it, like a lot of these old remedies. You can imagine there's a lot of heat generated under a fresh sheepskin, and it acts like a great hot poultice on the back. Really tickles them up after a while, and if a cow is lying there out of sheer cussedness, she'll often get up just to get rid of it. But damn it, how about the broken pelvis? I tell you it was creaking and wobbling all over the place. Well, James, you're not the first to have been caught that way. Sometimes the pelvic ligaments don't tighten up for a few days after calving, and you get this effect. Oh, God, I moaned, staring down at the tablecloth. What a bloody mess I've made of the whole thing. Oh, you haven't really. Siegfried lit a cigarette and leaned back in his chair. That old cow was probably toying with the idea of getting up for a walk, just when old Hanshaw dumped the skin on her back. She could just as easily have done it after one of your injections, and then you'd have got the credit. Don't you remember what I told you when you first came here? There's a very fine dividing line between looking a real smart vet on the one hand and an immortal fool on the other. This sort of thing happens to us all, so forget it, James. But forgetting wasn't so easy. That cow became a celebrity in the district. Mr. Hanshaw showed her with pride to the postman, the policeman, corn merchants, lorry drivers, fertilizer salesmen, Ministry of Agriculture officials, and they all told me about it frequently with pleased smiles. Mr. Hanshaw's speech was always the same, delivered, they said, in ringing, triumphant tones. There's the cow that Mr. Herriot said would never get up no more. I'm sure there was no malice behind the farmer's actions. He had put one over on the young Cleverpants vet, and nobody could blame him for preening himself a little. And in a way I did that cow a good turn. I considerably extended her lifespan, because Mr. Hanshaw kept her long beyond her normal working period, just as an exhibit. Years after she'd stopped giving more than a couple of gallons of milk a day, she was still grazing happily in the field by the roadside. She had one curiously upturned horn and was easy to recognize. I often pulled up my car and looked wistfully over the wall at the cow that would never get up no more. One more chapter today. Oh, maybe not. This one's short. We'll see. A lame calf leads me to Helen. A lot of the Dale farms were anonymous, and it was a help to find this one so plainly identified. Heston Grange, it said on the gate in bold black capitals. I got out of the car and undid the latch. It was a good gate, too, and swung easily on its hinges, instead of having to be dragged around with a shoulder under the top spar. The farmhouse lay below me, massive, grey-stoned, with a pair of bow windows which some prosperous Victorian had added to the original structure. It stood on a flat, green neck of land in a loop of the river, and the lushness of the grass and the quiet fertility of the surrounding fields contrasted sharply with the stark hills behind. Towering oaks and beeches sheltered the house, and a thick pine wood covered the lower slopes of the fell. I walked round the building, shouting as I always did, because some people considered it a subtle insult to go to the house and ask if the farmer was in. Good farmers are indoors only at meal times. But my shouts drew no reply, so I went over and knocked at the door, set deep among the weathered stones. A voice answered, "Come in," and I opened the door into a huge stone-flagged kitchen with hams and sides of bacon hanging from hooks in the ceiling. A dark girl in a checked blouse and green linen slacks was kneading dough in a bowl. She looked up and smiled. "Sorry I couldn't let you in. I've got my hands full." She held up her arms, flowery white to the elbow. "That's all right. My name is Herriot. I've come to see a calf. It's lame, I understand." "Yes, we think he's broken his leg. Probably got his foot in a hole when he was running about. If you don't mind waiting a minute, I'll come with you. My father and the men are in the fields. I'm Helen Alderson, by the way." She washed and dried her arms, and pulled on a pair of short Wellingtons. "Take over this bread, will you, Meg?" she said to an old woman who came through from an inner room. "I have to show Mr. Herriot the calf." Outside, she turned to me and laughed. "We've got a bit of a walk, I'm afraid. He's in one of the top buildings. Look, you can just see it up there." She pointed to a squat stone barn high on the fell side. I knew all about these top buildings. They were scattered all over the high country, and I got a lot of healthy exercise going round them. They were used for storing hay and other things, and as shelters for the animals on the hill pastures. I looked at the girls for a few seconds. "Oh, that's all right. I don't mind. I don't mind in the least." We went over the field to a narrow bridge spanning the river, and following her across, I was struck by a thought. This new fashion of women wearing slacks might be a bit revolutionary. That's dating itself. But there was a lot to be said for it. The path led upward through the pine wood, and here the sunshine was broken up into islands of brightness among the dark trunks. The sound of the river grew faint as we walked softly on a thick carpet of pine needles. It was cool in the wood and silent, except when a bird call echoed through the trees. 10 minutes of hard walking brought us out again into the hot sun on the open moor, and the path curved steeper still round a series of rocky outcrops. I was beginning to puff, but the girl kept up a brisk pace, swinging along with easy strides. I was glad when we reached the level ground on the top, and the barn came in sight again. When I opened the half door, I could hardly see my patient in the dark interior, which was heavy with the fragrance of hay piled nearly to the roof. He looked very small and sorry for himself with his dangling foreleg, which trailed uselessly along the strawed floor as he tried to walk. "Will you hold his head while I examine him, please?" I said. The girl caught the calf expertly, one hand under its chin, the other holding an ear. As I felt my way over the leg, the little creature stood trembling, his face a picture of woe. "Well, your diagnosis was correct. Clean fracture of the radius and ulna, but there's very little displacement, so it should do well with a plaster on it." I opened my bag, took out some plaster bandages, then filled a bucket with water from a nearby spring. I soaked one of the bandages and applied it to the leg, following it with a second and a third, till the limb was encased in a rapidly hardening white sheath from elbow to foot. "We'll just wait a couple of minutes till it hardens, then we can let him go," I said, tapping the plaster till I was satisfied it was set like stone. "All right," I said finally. "He can go now." The girl released the head, and the little animal trotted away. "Look," she cried, "he's putting his weight on it already. And doesn't he look a lot happier?" I smiled. I felt I had really done something. The calf felt no pain now that the broken ends of the bone were immobilized, and the fear which always demoralizes a hurt animal had magically vanished. "Yes," I said, "he certainly has perked up quickly." My words were almost drowned by a tremendous bellow, and a patch of blue above the half-door was suddenly obscured by a large, shaggy head. Two great liquid eyes stared down anxiously at the little calf, and it answered with a high-pitched bawl. Soon a deafening duet was in progress. "That's his mother," the girl shouted above the din. "Poor old thing, she's been hanging about here all morning, wondering what we've done with her calf. She hates being separated from him." I straightened up and drew the bolt on the door. "Well, she can come in now." The big cow almost knocked me down as she rushed past me. Then she started a careful, sniffling inspection of her calf, pushing him around with her muzzle and making muffled, lowing noises deep in her throat. The little creature submitted happily to all the fuss, and when it was over and his mother was finally satisfied, he limped round to her udder and began to suck heartily. "Soon got his appetite back," I said, and we both laughed. I threw the empty tins into my bag and closed it. "He'll have to keep the plaster on for a month, so if you give me a ring, then I'll come back and take it off. Just keep an eye on him and make sure his leg doesn't get sore around the top of the bandage." As we left the barn, the sunshine and the sweet warm air met us like a high wave. I turned and looked across the valley to the soaring green heights. Smooth, enormous, hazy in the noon heat. Beneath my feet the grassy slopes fell away steeply to where the river glimmered among the trees. "It's wonderful up here," I said. "Just look at that gorge over there, and that great hill. I suppose you could call it a mountain." I pointed at a giant which heaved its heather-mottled shoulders high above the others. "That's Heskett Fell, nearly 2,500 feet, and that's Eddleton just beyond, and Wedderfell on the other side, and Colver and Senor." She spoke their names with their wild Nordic ring. The names with their wild Nordic ring fell easily from her tongue. She spoke of them like old friends, and I could sense the affection in her voice. We sat down on the warm grass of the hillside. A soft breeze pulled at the heads of the moorland flowers, and somewhere a curlew cried. Derby and Skeldale House and veterinary practice seemed 1,000 miles away. "You're lucky to live here," I said, "but I don't think you need me to tell you that." "No, I love this country. There's nowhere else quite like it." She paused and looked slowly round her. "I'm glad it appeals to you, too. A lot of people find it too bare and wild. It almost seems to frighten them." I laughed. "Yes, I know. But as far as I'm concerned, I can't help feeling sorry for all the thousands of vets who don't work in the Yorkshire Dales." I began to talk about my work. Then, almost without knowing, I was going back over my student days, telling her of the good times, the friends I had made, and our hopes and aspirations. I surprised myself with my flow of talk. I wasn't much of a chatterbox, usually, and I felt I must be boring my companion. But she sat quietly looking over the valley, her arms around her green-clad legs, nodding at times as though she understood, and she laughed in all the right places. I wondered, too, at the silly feeling that I would like to forget all about the rest of the day's duty, and stay up here on this sunny hillside. It came to me that it had been a long time since I had sat down and talked to a girl of my own age. I had almost forgotten what it was like. I didn't hurry back down the path and through the scented pine wood, but it seemed no time at all before we were walking across the wooden bridge and over the field to the farm. I turned round with my hand on the car door. "Well, I'll see you in a month." It sounded like an awful long time. The girl smiled. "Thank you for what you've done." As I started the engine, she waved back and went into the house. "Helen Alderson," Siegfried said later over lunch. "Of course I know her. Lovely girl." Tristan, across the table, made no comment, but he laid down his knife and fork, raised his eyes reverently to the ceiling, and gave a low, long whistle. Then he started to eat again. Siegfried went on. "Oh yes, I know her very well, and I admire her. Her mother died a few years ago, and she runs the whole place, cooks and looks after her father and a younger brother and sister." He spooned some mashed potatoes onto his plate. "Any men friends?" "Oh, half the young bloods in the district are chasing her, but she doesn't seem to be going steady with any of them. Choosy sort, I think." Let's see. This one's a longer chapter next, so I think we will end it there for today. I had a longish day, so I think we'll do a shorter reading today. Tyrell suggested Munch books, Robert Munch at some point. Maybe we'll go there next. I think I'm going to take tomorrow off, so I won't be doing a reading tomorrow, and I won't be doing a reading on Saturday as usual. But we will do a reading on Sunday. So tomorrow, no reading Saturday. Sunday we'll tune in at 8:30 for our next novel, whatever that happens to be. If you have things you desperately want to hear next that you think I might have, let me know. I will go through my messages and such and make a list of the books that you have suggested, and then we'll see from there. Hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful night. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you on Sunday. You are quite welcome, Katya.